The exit interview at Callaway and Marsh took place in a small conference room on the sixth floor, the one with the broken blind that nobody had fixed in 3 years and a view of the parking garage that managed to be both uninspiring and oddly calming in the way that purely functional things sometimes are. The room smelled like printer toner and the particular staleness of recycled office air, and Sarah Okonkwo had been in it exactly once before, on her first day, 4 years ago, when it had been used for onboarding paperwork and a 40-minute orientation video that she had watched with the polite attention of someone who already knew most of what it contained. She sat across from a woman named Michelle from HR who had the professional warmth of someone trained to deliver difficult information in a manner that felt supportive without creating legal liability, and a man named Greg from finance who was there, as far as Sarah could tell, primarily to witness the signing of the separation agreement and to ensure that the severance terms were correctly communicated and acknowledged. Greg had a yellow legal pad on the table in front of him on which he had written 3 things when Sarah arrived, and had not written anything since. The separation agreement was 7 pages. Sarah had read it the previous evening. She had received it by email at 4:47 p.m. on Thursday, which gave her exactly enough time to review it before the Friday morning meeting if she worked through dinner, which she had. She had made notes in the margin of her printed copy in the particular shorthand she used for contract review. Asterisks for items requiring clarification, brackets around language that was broader than necessary, a small circle wherever the document said something she intended to remember. There were 4 circles. Michelle walked her through the key points: the severance amount, the non-disparagement clause, the non-solicitation period, the timeline for returning company equipment. Sarah listened and nodded at the appropriate moments and asked 2 questions, both precise and both answered without difficulty, because they were questions about things that were genuinely ambiguous in the text and not about things she intended to challenge. She was not going to challenge the agreement. She had decided this on Thursday evening, around the time she reached page 4 of the document, and understood that challenging it would cost her 6 to 8 months of her life and produce an outcome that would be, at best, marginally better than what was already on the table. She was 34 years old. She had 4 years of relationship capital with clients that did not appear anywhere in Callaway and Marsh's asset register because nobody had thought to put it there. She had things to do. "One last thing," Michelle said, with the careful tone of someone delivering the item they most want to go smoothly. "Regarding client communication, we'll be handling all outreach to your accounts directly. The transition will be managed by David Park, who'll be taking over your portfolio. We'd ask that you not reach out to clients independently during the non-solicitation period." Sarah looked at Michelle for a moment. "Of course," she said. "We want to make sure the transition is seamless," Michelle added. "I understand completely," Sarah said. She signed the agreement on the last page, initialed the bottom of each preceding page, and slid it back across the table. Michelle thanked her and told her that her personal items had been packed by facilities and were waiting at the front desk. Greg collected the signed documents, capped his pen, and stood up with the energy of a man who had somewhere else to be. Sarah shook hands with both of them. She thanked them. She meant it in the neutral, professional sense in which you thank someone for conducting a process correctly, not warmly, but genuinely, because the process had been conducted correctly and she had no particular interest in pretending otherwise. She took the elevator to the lobby. At the front desk, a young security officer handed her a medium-sized cardboard box containing the items from her desk: a ceramic mug, a small succulent she had brought from home in the first year and somehow kept alive through 4 cycles of office temperature neglect, a framed photograph, 3 notebooks, and a phone charger. She checked the contents against her mental inventory. Everything was there. She signed the equipment return form, surrendered her access badge, and walked out through the glass doors of Callaway and Marsh's Chicago office into a Friday morning in October that was doing the particular thing that October mornings in Chicago do. A crisp, slightly aggressive clarity in the air that felt more like a statement than a weather condition. She put the box in the trunk of her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The thing about Marcus Webb, the client, the 2.3 Manor account, the man who had been the largest single revenue relationship in her portfolio for 3 of her 4 years at the firm, was that he had a specific and consistent communication style that Sarah had understood within approximately 6 weeks of first working with him, and that the rest of the firm had never quite grasped. He did not respond well to institutional communication. He did not like receiving emails from addresses that ended in the company domain when he expected to hear from a specific person. He had once told her, in the blunt and not unkind way that characterized most of his professional conversation, that he worked with people, not with companies, and that the distinction mattered to him in a way that was non-negotiable. She had built the relationship accordingly. Quarterly calls, always her. Annual in-person review, always her. The contract renewals, always negotiated directly between the two of them, with the final terms agreed in a conversation before the paperwork was ever drafted. She had known his assistant's name, his travel schedule in broad terms, the fact that he preferred morning calls to afternoon ones, and that he had a particular impatience for process language that didn't translate to outcomes. She had also known, and this was the part that Calloway and Marsh's leadership had not known, because she had never been asked and had never volunteered it, that Marcus Webb had, 14 months ago during a contract renewal conversation, asked her directly whether she was planning to stay at the firm long term. She had said yes, which had been true at the time. He had said in his direct way, "Good, because I follow the person, not the address. You should know that." She had filed that conversation in the same place she filed most things that mattered, in the part of her memory she kept organized, accessible, and very quiet. She started the car and pulled out of the parking garage into the October morning. Michelle from HR was, at that precise moment, drafting an email to Marcus Webb's account address, the general inbox, not the direct line, introducing David Park as the new point of contact for his account and expressing confidence in the transition. The email was well written and professionally warm and contained no information that would have given Marcus Webb any particular reason to respond to it, rather than forward it to his assistant for filing. His assistant would receive it on Monday morning and flag it as requiring follow-up. Marcus Webb would not see it until Tuesday. By then, he would have already sent Sarah a message on LinkedIn. He would send it on Monday at 11:07 a.m., and it would contain 31 words, and those 31 words would arrive on Sarah's phone while she was making coffee in her apartment kitchen, and she would read them once, set the phone face down on the counter, and stand very still for approximately 15 seconds while she thought about what she wanted to do next. She already knew. She had known since Thursday evening, around page 4. The LinkedIn notification arrived on Monday at 11:07 a.m., and it made the specific sound that LinkedIn notifications make. A sound Sarah had muted on every other platform, but had left active here for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, possibly because LinkedIn notifications were infrequent enough to still feel like they meant something. She was standing at the kitchen counter in her apartment, still in the clothes she had slept in, waiting for the coffee to finish. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that Monday mornings are quiet when you no longer have anywhere to be. A silence with a slightly different texture than weekend silence, more loaded, more aware of itself. She had spent the previous day doing the things you do on the first full day after a job ends. A long walk, a reorganization of her desk that was more about having something deliberate to do than about actual necessity, an honest assessment of her finances that confirmed what she already knew, which was that she had time. She picked up the phone. The message was from Marcus Webb. 31 words. She counted them later, not because the number mattered, but because it was the kind of thing her mind did when something was important. Cataloged the details, measured the weight. Sarah, heard through the grapevine you've left Calloway. We have the renewal coming up in 3 weeks. I'd like to talk before I make any decisions. Are you available this week? She set the phone face down on the counter. She stood very still for approximately 15 seconds. Then she poured her coffee, took it to the kitchen table, and sat down. The non-solicitation clause in her separation agreement covered active outreach to Calloway and Marsh clients for the purpose of soliciting their business. She had read it 3 times on Thursday evening and understood it precisely. What it did not cover, what it could not cover, because no reasonable non-solicitation clause could cover it without becoming legally unenforceable, was responding to unsolicited inbound communication from a former client who had reached out independently, of their own accord, without any prompting. Marcus Webb had messaged her. She had not messaged Marcus Webb. The distinction was not a technicality. It was the entire architecture of what happened next. She picked up the phone and typed a reply. She kept it short, shorter than his message, which was a deliberate choice, because Marcus Webb was a person who responded well to economy of language and poorly to people who over-explained themselves. Marcus, yes, I'm available. Wednesday morning works for me if it works for you. She sent it and put the phone down. Inside Calloway and Marsh, the Monday morning was proceeding with the particular momentum of the first day of a transition that everyone had been told would be seamless. David Park had received a briefing document on the web account on Friday afternoon. 12 pages covering account history, contract terms, renewal timeline, and relationship notes. He had read it over the weekend with the diligence of someone who understood that this was a significant account and that significant accounts required preparation. What the briefing document did not contain, because nobody had written it down because it existed entirely in Sarah's understanding of the relationship and had never been formalized, was the thing Marcus Webb had told her 14 months ago. I follow the person, not the address. David Park sent Marcus Webb an email at 9:30 a.m. Monday introducing himself and expressing his enthusiasm for continuing the partnership. It was well written. It was professional. It was sent to the general inbox. Marcus Webb's assistant received it at 9:34 a.m. and flagged it for follow-up review later in the week. At 11:07 a.m., Marcus Webb sent his LinkedIn message to Sarah. At 11:23 a.m., Sarah replied. At 2:15 p.m., David Park sent a follow-up email to the general inbox asking if there was a good time for an introductory call. At 3:40 p.m., Marcus Webb's assistant replied to David Park's email suggesting a call the following week, Thursday at 10 a.m., pending confirmation. At 4:52 p.m., Marcus Webb replied to Sarah's LinkedIn message, Wednesday 9 a.m., I'll send a calendar invite. Talk soon. None of these four exchanges were visible to any of the other parties. Calloway and Marsh did not know that Marcus Webb had contacted Sarah. Sarah did not know that David Park had emailed Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was conducting two parallel conversations with the full awareness that they were parallel and the complete intention of letting them run until Wednesday, when he would have the information he needed to decide what he wanted to do. This was entirely consistent with how Marcus Webb operated. He gathered information before making decisions. He talked to the people he trusted. He did not announce his conclusions until they were conclusions. Sarah understood this about him. It was one of approximately 30 things she understood about him that were not in the 12-page briefing document. She spent Monday afternoon doing something she had been meaning to do for several months, updating her own records. Not for any immediate purpose, but because the habit of documentation was one she had maintained throughout her career and intended to maintain now. She opened a new document on her laptop and wrote, in clean and organized prose, a summary of her relationship with Marcus Webb, the history, the communication preferences, the 14-month-old conversation, the renewal timeline, the contract terms as she understood them. She noted the date of each significant interaction. She noted the substance of each significant conversation. She saved the document in a folder she labeled simply Webb. Then she made dinner, watched something forgettable on television, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in approximately 3 years, because she no longer had a 7 a.m. standing call with the Asia-Pacific team, and the particular physical relief of that absence was something she had not anticipated and was choosing to acknowledge. Wednesday came with the same October clarity as the Friday before it, that specific Chicago autumn light that made everything look more consequential than it perhaps was, or perhaps exactly as consequential as it was, depending on how you chose to read it. The call with Marcus Webb was scheduled for 9 a.m. She was at her kitchen table at 8:47, coffee on the left, the Webb document open on her laptop on the right, the phone in the center. She was wearing a blazer, which was not strictly necessary for a phone call, but was consistent with the way she had always prepared for calls with him. Not performatively, but as a form of personal discipline, a signal to herself that this was a working conversation and should be treated as one. He called at exactly 9 p.m. Sarah. Marcus, I'll get to it, he said, which was how he always started conversations he considered important. I got an email from someone named David Park this morning saying he's my new point of contact. I haven't called him back. I know, she said. I want to understand the situation before the renewal. Are you available to work on this? She had thought carefully about how to answer this question. She had thought about it on Monday after his first message, and on Tuesday during a walk along the lakefront, and on Wednesday morning over the first cup of coffee before she had opened the Webb document or put on the blazer. She had thought about the non-solicitation clause, and about the difference between solicitation and consultation, and about the specific nature of what Marcus Webb was asking. He was not asking her to steal his business from Calloway and Marsh. He was asking whether she was available in the broadest sense, available as a person, available as someone whose judgment he trusted, to help him think through a decision that was his to make. I'm not in a position to solicit your business, she said, but I can have a conversation with you, and if you decide independently that you want to work with me going forward, that's a decision you're entitled to make. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That's what I thought you'd say, Marcus said. It's also what I would have said. A brief sound that might have been something close to amusement. I'm going to need 30 days to restructure the contract. Are you setting up independently or going somewhere? Independently, she said. Then let's talk about what that looks like, he said. I have 40 minutes. She moved the phone to her left hand and picked up her pen with her right. Downstairs in the lobby of Callaway and Marsh's Chicago office, a courier was delivering a package to the front desk. On the 6th floor, David Park was preparing for a client call that had nothing to do with Marcus Webb. In Michelle from HR's calendar, the Webb account transition was listed as complete with a green check mark. Nobody had called Marcus Webb to ask how the transition was going. He would have told them. The call lasted 38 minutes. Sarah had expected 40 because Marcus Webb said 40 minutes, and Marcus Webb was a person who meant what he said with a precision that most people reserved for legal documents. The 2-minute discrepancy was, she would reflect later, entirely consistent with his operating style. He had finished what he needed to finish and ended the call without padding it, because padding was a thing he had no patience for and had never pretended otherwise. She sat at the kitchen table after he hung up and did not move for a moment. The conversation had covered 4 things. First, his assessment of the current contract, the terms, the renewal timeline, the specific provisions he wanted to revisit. Second, his understanding of what her independent practice would look like and what she would need to set it up properly. Third, a direct and unemotional account of his position. He was not willing to sign a renewal with Callaway and Marsh under current circumstances, where his key relationship had been eliminated without consultation or transition planning, and he intended to communicate this to the firm before the renewal deadline. Fourth, and this was the part she had written down in 3 separate places in her notebook, his intentions regarding the contract structure going forward. He wanted a personal services agreement, not with a firm, with her specifically as an independent consultant, with a scope of work that reflected what she had actually been doing for 3 years, and a fee structure that reflected the market rate for that work rather than the internal transfer pricing that had governed it at Callaway and Marsh. She had not proposed this. He had. She had said she would need 2 weeks to establish the proper legal and financial structure for independent consulting work, and he had said 2 weeks was fine, he had 3, and that he would hold the renewal pending her confirmation. She had thanked him with the same neutral professionalism she brought to everything, and had not allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened until the call ended and the line went quiet. Now she allowed it. She made a second cup of coffee. The first had gone cold during the call, and sat back at the table and looked at her notes. 3 pages, her shorthand, the asterisks and brackets and small circles. At the top of the first page, she had written the date and time. At the bottom of the 3rd page, she had written one number, underlined once. 2.3. Not her number. Not yet. But a number with her name in its vicinity, moving in her direction, because a person she had spent 3 years building a genuine professional relationship with had decided that the relationship was worth more than the institutional address it had been attached to. She opened her laptop and started a new document. The list of things she needed to do was not short. Register a business entity. She had researched the options and had a preference. Open a business bank account. Draft a consulting agreement template, or have one drafted, which meant finding an attorney whose work she trusted and whose turnaround time was compatible with a 3-week deadline. Set up a proper invoicing system. Review her professional liability insurance options. Update her LinkedIn profile in a way that was factual and professional and communicated her availability without being performative about it. She was a person who made lists and worked through them in order, and she found a specific and uncomplicated satisfaction in this. The same satisfaction she found in a well-structured contract or a client call that covered everything it needed to cover in the time allocated. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly. She worked through the afternoon. At 4:30 p.m., she sent a brief email to an attorney she had worked with previously on a contract matter, asking if she had capacity to assist with a business formation and consulting agreement on a short timeline. At 5:15 p.m., she received a reply, yes, available Thursday. At 6:00 p.m., she closed the laptop and cooked dinner. She did not think about Callaway and Marsh in any particularly charged way. She thought about them the way you think about a place you have left, with a clear-eyed assessment of what it had been, what it had given her, and what it had failed to understand about what it had. The failure was not malicious. It was the ordinary institutional failure of organizations that manage portfolios instead of relationships, that move people around a spreadsheet without fully accounting for the things that spreadsheets cannot contain. She had been a line item. Marcus Webb had not been. The gap between those two facts was where she now lived. Inside Callaway and Marsh, the Wednesday had ended without incident. David Park's introductory email to Marcus Webb had received a brief reply from his assistant confirming a call for the following Thursday. This was logged in the CRM as transition in progress, on track. The green checkmark in Michelle's calendar remained green. Nobody knew about the 9 a.m. call. Nobody knew about the 3 pages of notes on Sarah's kitchen table. Nobody knew that Marcus Webb had already, in his own precise and unhurried way, made his decision, and that the decision was not complicated because he was a person who followed people and not addresses, and the person he followed had, as of that Wednesday morning, an address of her own. On Thursday, Sarah met with the attorney. The business entity was formed in 4 days. The consulting agreement template was drafted in 6. On the 8th day after the Wednesday call, she sent Marcus Webb a brief email. From a new address, a clean domain, her name, and nothing else, confirming that she was operational and ready to proceed. He replied in 11 minutes. Good. Send me the agreement. I'll have it back to you by end of week. She printed his reply, put it in a folder, and labeled the folder the way she labeled everything that mattered, with the date, the name, and one word that described what it was. The word she chose was first. The signed agreement came back on a Friday, exactly 1 week after she had sent it, which was consistent with what Marcus Webb had said, and therefore consistent with everything she knew about him. She opened the email at 7:43 a.m. before coffee, which was unusual for her. She had been checking her inbox with a frequency that she acknowledged was not entirely professional, but was entirely human. The particular vigilance of someone waiting for a thing that will confirm that the decision they made was the right one, not because she doubted the decision, but because confirmation, when it arrives, has its own specific weight that anticipation cannot replicate. The email was 4 sentences. The agreement was attached. He had signed on the last page and initialed each preceding page, which was exactly what she had done with the Callaway and Marsh separation agreement 3 weeks earlier, on the same table, in the same apartment, with the same pen. She noticed this symmetry and allowed herself to find it appropriate. She printed the agreement. She signed her own copy. She scanned it and sent it back. Then she made coffee. The consulting fee was structured as a quarterly retainer, a clean, simple arrangement that reflected the actual nature of the work, which was ongoing relationship management and strategic advisory rather than project-based deliverables. The annual value was 2.3 Malers, which was the same number she had underlined on the 3rd page of her call notes 2 weeks earlier, and which represented, in practical terms, the entirety of what she needed to build everything else from. She understood this clearly and without drama. One client was not a practice, it was a foundation. What you built on a foundation depended entirely on the quality of the work you did, the relationships you maintained, and the discipline with which you managed the gap between what clients expected and what you actually delivered. She had spent 4 years building that discipline inside someone else's structure. She now had the opportunity to build it inside her own. She opened her laptop and started the list for the week. At Callaway and Marsh, the Thursday call between David Park and Marcus Webb's assistant had been rescheduled twice, once because of a conflict on David's side, once because of a conflict on the assistant's side, and had ultimately taken place on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks after Sarah's last day. The call had lasted 11 minutes. David had introduced himself, outlined his background, expressed his commitment to the account. The assistant had been polite and efficient and had said that Mr. Webb would be in touch regarding the renewal timeline. Mr. Webb had not been in touch. On the Friday that Sarah received the signed agreement, the Webb account renewal deadline was 11 days away. The Callaway and Marsh CRM still showed the transition status as in progress, on track. David Park had sent 2 follow-up emails to the general inbox. Both had received brief, professionally non-committal replies from the assistant. The account director, a man named Richard Holt, who had been Sarah's manager for the final 2 years of her time at the firm and who had signed the separation agreement on behalf of the company, noticed the lack of movement on a Friday afternoon when he was reviewing the pipeline and found the Webb renewal sitting without a confirmed meeting, without a draft term sheet, and without any direct communication from Marcus Webb himself. He called David Park. David Park explained the situation as he understood it, which was that the client had been responsive at an administrative level but had not yet engaged substantively on renewal terms. Richard Holt listened and then asked a question that was direct in the way that questions become direct when the person asking them already suspects the answer. Has Marcus Webb spoken to anyone at this firm in the last 3 weeks? David Park checked his records. His assistant, he said. 3 times. Richard Holt was quiet for a moment. He had worked with Marcus Webb twice before Sarah joined the firm, briefly on 2 separate engagements, and he remembered with considerable clarity the thing Marcus Webb had said to him during the second one, something about preferring to work with people rather than institutions, delivered without hostility, but with a firmness that had suggested it was not a preference but a policy. He had assigned Sarah to the account 4 years ago partly because of that conversation, because she was the person on his team most likely to understand what it meant and act accordingly. She had. The account had grown from $800,000 to 2.3 million in 3 years. He sat with that number for a moment. Then he called Marcus Webb's direct line, a number he had not used in 4 years, that he had kept in his phone out of habit rather than expectation. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a message. Professional, measured, appropriately concerned without being alarmed. He asked Marcus to call him back at his earliest convenience regarding the upcoming renewal. Marcus Webb did not call back that day. He did not call back the following Monday either, which was when Richard Holt began to understand, with the particular clarity that comes from a silence that has gone on slightly too long, that something had already happened. Something outside the CRM, outside the transition plan, outside the green check marks and the 11-minute introductory calls, and that the shape of it was becoming visible in the negative space of what Marcus Webb was not doing. He called Michelle from HR on Monday afternoon. The web account, he said, the transition. Walk me through what happened. Michelle walked him through it. The exit interview, the non-solicitation clause, the instruction not to contact clients independently, all standard, all correctly executed. Did Sarah say anything about Webb specifically? Richard asked. During the interview? Michelle thought about it. No, she said. She was very cooperative. She asked 2 questions about the agreement and signed without objection. Richard was quiet. Did we ask her anything about Webb? He said. About the relationship. About anything we needed to know for the transition. A pause. We covered it in the briefing document, Michelle said. Richard said nothing for a moment. Then he thanked her and ended the call. He sat at his desk and looked out the window at the parking garage, the same view from the same building that Sarah had looked at 3 weeks ago in the small conference room with the broken blind, and thought about the 12-page briefing document that David Park had received on a Friday afternoon, and about the things that 12 pages can contain and the things they cannot. What Sarah knew about Marcus Webb that was not in the document could not have been put in the document because it was not information. It was a relationship. 4 years of consistent, attentive, specific human presence that had made a 2.3-meter account feel, from Marcus Webb's side of it, like a conversation between people rather than a transaction between entities. You cannot transfer a relationship in a briefing document. You cannot sign it over in a separation agreement. You cannot reassign it to David Park or anyone else because it does not belong to the firm. It belongs to the person who built it. Richard Holt understood this on a Monday afternoon in October, looking at a parking garage 11 days before a renewal deadline that was no longer going to be met. 3 miles away, in an apartment with a kitchen table and a folder labeled First, Sarah Okonkwo was on a call with a second prospective client, someone Marcus Webb had mentioned offhandedly at the end of their Wednesday conversation. In the way that people mention things they intend to happen, she had her notebook open, she had her pen in her right hand. The coffee on the left was still warm. The second client's name was Diane Osei, and she ran a mid-sized logistics company in the western suburbs of Chicago that had been looking for strategic advisory support for approximately 8 months without finding what it was looking for. Marcus Webb had mentioned her name in the last 4 minutes of their Wednesday call, in the offhand manner he used for things he had already decided were worth mentioning, which meant in practice that he had thought about it before the call, weighed it, and concluded it was relevant. He had said, "There's someone you should talk to. Diane Osei, Meridian Logistics. Tell her I suggested it." And then he had ended the call at 38 minutes, 2 minutes early, because he was finished. Sarah had written the name at the bottom of the 3rd page of her notes, circled it once, and moved on. She called Diane Osei on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the Webb agreement was signed. She introduced herself, mentioned Marcus Webb's name, and said she understood Diane had been looking for advisory support and would welcome a conversation if she was still open to it. Diane Osei said she had been expecting the call. They met the following Tuesday at a coffee shop in Oak Park. Diane's suggestion, which Sarah noted as a preference for neutral ground and filed accordingly. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, which was 45 minutes longer than either of them had scheduled, because the conversation had gone somewhere useful, and neither of them had any particular interest in stopping it before it was finished. Sarah came away with a clear picture of what Meridian Logistics needed, which was not complicated but had been made to seem complicated by the two firms Diane had spoken to previously, both of which had proposed elaborate retainer structures involving multiple service lines and a team of 4 people, when what Diane actually needed was one person who understood her business and could be reached on a Tuesday afternoon without going through 3 layers of account management. Sarah proposed a 6-month engagement, a focused scope, a clean fee structure, a single point of contact. Her. Diane signed 2 weeks later. The Callaway and Marsh renewal deadline passed on a Thursday without a signed agreement. Richard Holt had spent the preceding 11 days attempting to re-establish direct contact with Marcus Webb through every available channel. His direct line, his assistant, 2 emails to his personal address that Richard had obtained from an old business card, and 1 message through a mutual professional contact who had agreed to pass along a note. Marcus Webb had replied to none of them directly. His assistant had sent 1 email acknowledging receipt of the most recent proposal and noting that Mr. Webb was reviewing his options. On the deadline date, Marcus Webb sent a brief, formally worded letter to Callaway and Marsh's managing director, not to Richard Holt, not to David Park, but to the managing director, which was a choice that communicated something precise about how seriously he intended the message to be taken. The letter stated that he had decided not to renew his engagement with the firm at this time, that he wished the firm well, and that he was grateful for the work done on his behalf over the preceding years. He did not mention Sarah's name. He did not need to. The managing director forwarded the letter to Richard Holt with a single line of accompanying text. "Call me." Richard Holt called. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and covered the account history, the transition process, the separation decision, and a series of questions that did not have comfortable answers. At the end of it, the managing director asked Richard to prepare a written assessment of what had happened and what structural changes, if any, were warranted in how the firm managed key client relationships going forward. Richard wrote the assessment over a weekend. It was 9 pages long and said, in the careful and qualified language of internal institutional documents, essentially what he had understood on the Monday afternoon when he looked at the parking garage and thought about the things that 12-page briefing documents cannot contain. The assessment was filed, reviewed, and discussed at a leadership meeting the following month. Several of its recommendations were implemented in modified form over the following quarter. One of them, a protocol requiring direct client relationship mapping before any senior departure, was adopted in full and added to the firm's standard offboarding process. Nobody sent Sarah a copy. She would not have expected one. By the end of November, 6 weeks after she had printed the signed web agreement and labeled a folder first, her practice had 2 clients, a functioning administrative structure, a business bank account with a balance that reflected 1 full quarterly retainer payment received and 1 partial payment on its way, and a waiting list of 1, a referral from Diane Osei, a contact of hers in the manufacturing sector who had heard about the Meridian Logistics engagement and wanted to have a conversation. Sarah had scheduled the conversation for the first week of December. She had also done something she had been meaning to do since the first week after leaving Callaway and Marsh, which was update the framed photograph that had been in the cardboard box from her desk. It had been a generic landscape, something she had bought at a market years ago and put in a frame because the desk had felt bare without it. She replaced it with something she had taken herself, on her phone, on a walk along the lakefront in October. The water and the sky and the particular quality of light that Chicago produces in autumn when it decides to be beautiful about it. She put it on her desk in her apartment, in the practice that had her name on it and nobody else's, and went back to work. The work was the same work she had always done. The conversations, the relationships, the careful attention to what clients actually needed, as opposed to what they thought they needed or what a 12-page document said they needed. The work of being present and specific and consistent over time, which was not complicated and was not glamorous, and was, in her experience, the only thing that actually produced the results that everyone wanted, and most people found ways to avoid doing properly. She did it properly. She had always done it properly. The difference now was that when she did it, the value of it went into a folder with her name on it, into a bank account with her name on it, into a practice that was, in the most literal and unambiguous sense, hers. On the last Friday of November, she received an email from Marcus Webb. It was brief. He was always brief, and it contained two things: a note that the first quarter had gone well and he was satisfied with the engagement, and a name. A third referral: someone he had spoken to at a dinner the previous week who was, he said, exactly the kind of client she should be working with. She wrote the name at the top of a new page in her notebook. She drew a circle around it. She made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and picked up the phone.